Hello and welcome to the webcast titled Research Ethics, an Introduction to the Purpose and Process of Research Ethics Review in Community and University. We have just a few announcements before we begin. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located above the presentation window. Should you need technical assistance, click on the Help button. If your screen freezes or the slides do not appear to be advancing as they should, please try exiting and restarting the session as it may be an issue with your connectivity. At any time, you can submit a question using the box on the left-hand side of the screen. I would now like to turn the call over to Jen McNeil so that we can begin.
Thanks, Russ. Dr. Barbara Clow is our presenter this afternoon, so I would like to welcome her and just give you a little bit of a history as to her background and her education so that you know where she's coming from. She is currently the Executive Director of the Atlantic Center of Excellence for Women's Health and the Associate Professor of Research in the Faculty of Health Professions at Dalhousie University. She has a PhD in the History of Medicine from the University of Toronto and has presented and published on various dimensions of the history of medicine in Canada and the United States. She is also the author of the only monograph on the history of cancer in Canada, and it's titled Negotiating Disease, Power, and Cancer Care, 1900 to 1950. Postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Wisconsin, York University, and Dalhousie University enabled Dr. Clow to augment her training in the humanities with a growing expertise in the social sciences. Her extensive and well-funded program of research has focused on the social determinants of health for vulnerable populations of women and girls, such as African Canadians, immigrants, unpaid caregivers, and those at risk or living with HIV and AIDS. Her work also comprises a commitment to research that considers the implications of public policy transformation for the health and well-being of women and girls around the world. Dr. Clow fosters robust, multidisciplinary, and intersectoral networks, locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, and offers unique opportunities for research trainees from diverse disciplinary backgrounds. So on that note, Dr. Barbara Clow, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us today and presenting this to us.
Thanks, Jen. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts and background and knowledge about ethics reviews. This presentation originated with the Canadian Breast Cancer Network inviting me to one of its regional consultations and asking me to develop a presentation on ethics for members, for regional members, as part of the skills and capacity building dimension of CBCN. And so this is a slightly modified version. You'll see from the slide on your screen the various aspects of the presentation that I'm going to go through. The only one that's missing from this presentation is a section entitled Case Study. We, in the session in Halifax that we did on ethics reviews, we actually had an opportunity, because people were all together in the room, to work through a particular example of an ethics proposal and a piece of research with the folks who were in the room, and just to get a sense of what ethics looks like with respect to the community perspective and from the perspective of universities, and why there's sometimes a lot of challenge in getting those two perspectives to come together comfortably. So I think we all recognize that research is important and necessary to deepen and broaden our knowledge of the world and people in the world. And we increasingly have recognized that we need to take care of the people that we're asking to share their experiences and information with us, and that we can find it challenging to sort through what we mean by ethics and how we go about ensuring that the research we are engaged in is ethical. And this is important not just for university-based researchers and community-based researchers, but also for the not-for-profit and other partners who work with them. So I want to spend some time today going over the concepts and principles that inform ethics review of research, and then looking at the differences between ethics reviews undertaken in universities and communities, and to look at the various components of an ethics review. So you can see on the slide there that the background is going to be some of the history, followed by the basic concepts, then community versus university-based research ethics reviews, and then what are the parts of an ethics review that we want to pay attention to. So, ethics reviews or ethics as a concept has a really long history. You'll see the picture on the left is a picture of Hippocrates, who was one of the first writers that we know of, at least within Western civilization, to really talk about the concept of ethics. And we know you'll be very familiar with the Hippocratic Oath that doctors are required to undertake, the basis of which is to do no harm. That's supposed to be the first and grounding principle of ethics. And we've shifted, added to that concept and made that concept more sophisticated over time. But it was not really until the middle of the 20th century. I keep wanting to say this century when we've already moved on to the 21st century, so forgive me if I make that step. But the first real attempt to systematize ethics standards came out of Nazi activities and the Nuremberg trials following the Second World War that led to the expose of all of the horrific human experimentation that had gone on during the Second World War, and particularly was associated with the Nazis. And the Nuremberg trials that were one of the first sort of trials of war criminals was also focused on needing to develop better methods of undertaking research, ones that paid attention to the ethical dimensions of research. Now, despite the long history of interest in protecting patients and research subjects and the response to the devastating revelations of human experimentation under the Nazis, getting everyone to accept the need for ethical research has been a very gradual process. So we have a code of ethics that came out of the Nuremberg era, but that has continued to evolve and be shaped over time. And there's still been lots of examples of failures to conduct ethical research since the Second World War, notwithstanding the Nuremberg Code. So you'll see up on the top left of your screen a picture of some children who were born after their mothers had taken thalidomide in the 1960s with the resulting impact on their bodies. And you can also see a picture down on the bottom left of an African-American man who's having blood taken. This is an example of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments that took place from the 1930s to the 1970s in the United States. So while everybody was paying attention to what the Nazis were doing and being critical of what the Nazis were doing, many other countries in the Western world were also conducting experimentation and were not criticized for it. So in this particular example, a lot of African Americans in the South of the United States were drawn into what essentially was a clinical trial. So they were offered public health and other kinds of health support in return for being monitored, so having blood taken, having physical examinations and that kind of thing. But what made this particular project so completely unethical was that with the development of antibiotics, a cure for syphilis was discovered. And this cure was withheld from all the participants in the Tuskegee experiments. And it was only when this revelation came to light in the 1970s that the whole process was closed down. Those people who were still living and had survived the experiment, in effect, were then treated and cured, but many, many people had died in the process. Now, we have three major research granting agencies in Canada: the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. In 1994, these three organizations began consultations about the development of a joint policy on research ethics. And this led to the release of the first national guidelines in 1998. But just to give you a sense of how much this was needed. So while CIHR and SHRC and NSERC were all talking about this, we had the case of Nancy Oliveri, who discovered that the treatment for thalassemia, the Apotex treatments, were actually damaging the health of children. And she blew the whistle on the pharmaceutical company and was vilified in the press for a long time, and only recently, well, only after quite a few years and lots of damage to her reputation and her practice and her vocation was she actually vindicated. So coming out of those discussions amongst the 3 research granting agencies in Canada, a single policy was developed, which is referred to as the Tri-Council Policy on Human Research. And there are some core concepts involved in that particular policy, and they're in front of you now. So essentially the concepts that the 3 agencies could agree upon were that we need to have respect for human dignity. We need to ensure that research participants are engaged in the research through free and informed consent. We need to pay attention to the fact that particular individuals are especially vulnerable and consequently may need more intervention in order to undertake ethical research and protect them from any harms. That an ethical research project involves protection of the privacy and confidentiality of participants, and that justice and inclusiveness are key components of an ethical research process. And I'm going to talk about some of these in turn a little bit later. I just wanted to give you an idea, first of all, what those key components are. And in addition to the concepts, the development of this last statement on balancing harms and benefits is clearly there's a lot of resonance here from Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath. But in addition to saying we're going to reduce harms, there was a clear recognition amongst researchers that research needed to also benefit the participants, and benefit the community. So it might not necessarily give benefit to the particular people who were involved in research at the time, but the thought was that it would ultimately help others if it wasn't going to help. It would give us new knowledge that would help other people. So I think it's likely that we would all agree with these principles. We would think that they're important to pay attention to, and that we would all feel that we're following them when we're conducting research. And all of us, as you'll see from this cartoon, are assuming, believing, hoping, trying very hard to be on the high road for ethics, protecting those that we are working with and ensuring that they are not hurt or abused in any way. But it can be challenging to address every possible harm that can occur in the midst of research and to maximize all the benefits to ensure confidentiality and privacy for those that share their experiences with us and ultimately to find our way through the process of ethics reviews. And I'm going to specifically talk about 2 different kinds of ethics reviews. One is based in the university, and that's a picture of lovely Dalhousie, where I'm based, and the other is community-based research. I think it's important to look at the context of research because the ethics processes that take place in these 2 settings are often quite different, and yet what we're really asking people to do is to bridge those differences when they're developing research or university community partnerships and research that involves community. So each of them has strengths and limitations, and each type of research represents specific challenges and opportunities. So depending on the nature of your research and who you are doing it with will have a major impact on the decision to use a university ethics review process or those based in communities and organizations outside of the university. But both university and community-based ethics reviews, need to involve particular components that address the principles we discussed earlier. And I just want to look briefly at the pros and cons of these 2 approaches. Now, university-based research is highly structured and highly regulated in terms of its ethics. So when you're based in a university, you're not going to get any access to the funds that have been advanced through grants and other kinds of funding agreements. You're not going to get access to any of that money until you demonstrate that your research has received approval from an ethics board that consists of folks within the university that it changes on a regular basis. So there's lots of oversight. It's highly, highly structured. There are forms you have to fill out. The forms have lots of guidance on here's what you need to fill out here, here's what you need to fill out there. It's also arm's length from the researcher. So it's not just me or another researcher saying my research is ethical. It's rather a group of my peers who are looking at my research and saying, yes, this is credible, this is ethical. And if they have questions, that I'm obliged to answer those questions before I'll get approval from them. And this process now has been well established for a number of years, and it has enormous credibility with funders. So you can say to a granting agency, here's the evidence that I'm undertaking ethical research. Now, the downside of undertaking a university-based research ethics process is that it's slow. Or committees typically meet once a month, sometimes not in the summer. If they have a big backlog of applications, it takes that much longer to go through them. The process can be very complicated. When you're filling out an ethics application at most universities, it can feel like you're saying the same thing 6 different ways in the process of filling out that form and getting ethics approval. And I would say it's fairly static. So there's not a lot of interaction between the researcher, the community, the participants, and the ethics review board. And that means that the research may not be as flexible and responsive to the needs of the people who are involved as it might be in with another approach to ethics reviews. And so that takes us over to the community-based research process. The positive side of community-based research ethics review is that it tends to be rather more informal than a university-based process. It's also highly responsive to the needs of participants, and it's dynamic. So if you're in the midst of your research and you realize that you've hit an ethical bump, you're in a position to quickly respond to that, change your process, and or change the kinds of questions you're asking or who you're involving. So, for example, if you're in the midst of a research process and you realize that you've not included participants from a particular community or population, and that this is a problem because those people have something important to say that you're not going to capture as a function of having excluded them either deliberately or inadvertently, you can change course at that point and include them. Whereas with a university-based approach, you have to have thought about all of that up front and put it into the ethics board and gotten back your answers. And it doesn't mean that you can't change your process. But, for example, if you wanted to rewrite an interview guide for interviews or a focus group guide so that you could ask different questions, you would need to go back to your ethics board and get that re-reviewed before you could continue. Now, the downside of community-based research ethics reviews is that they tend to be rather ad hoc. A piece of research that we did here at the Atlantic Center a number of years ago, trying to get a real handle on what community-based research ethics involves, demonstrated that it's not really well systematized, and it tends to be rather invisible to outsiders. So the particular researchers involved and the community-based organizations may have a very clear idea of how they've reviewed a particular research application, and they may be very clear about why a particular piece of research is not going to work with the communities they serve and work with, but that's not really obvious. And the process can tend to be rather selective in the sense that you tend to trust the opinions and the work of people that you've already been working with. So I know that researcher X has treated participants fairly and ethically in the past, so I'm going to work with researcher X, even though researcher Y may have an equally valid research design and research process. Because they're not familiar to me and or to my community, then I may be less likely to feel comfortable about working with them. So I want to turn next to the basic components of the research process. And you'll see that I've tended not to include much in the way of text in my presentation. I typically don't. I'd much rather have you look at interesting things and listen to me. And I hope you're laughing out there at some of these cartoons, although I can't tell if you are or not. So I want to just look at those components that I mentioned earlier. we can see that these ethics reviews revolve around the principles of dignity, inclusiveness, etc. And much of what we can talk about pertains to university-based ethics reviews simply because it's a formalized process. But we'll also talk about how these principles could be addressed in community-based research projects. So the first one we mentioned is human dignity. Now, this principle focuses on the subjects, or what the language that we use more now is participants in a research project, and paying attention to respecting their dignity as individuals, as well as noting and trying to address the potential harms and the benefits of a particular research project. Now, in university settings, ethics reviews require very lengthy explanations about what the research is meant to achieve and why it is valuable to address a particular issue or work with a particular population. And usually this involves a lengthy literature review that builds on research that's already been done. Now, often when you're doing literature reviews, you can identify a gap that needs to be addressed. But the research gap may not necessarily align with the needs of those who are involved in the study. We find often when we're working with vulnerable populations, for example, and I'm thinking here of working with First Nations peoples, that as researchers we can come up with the idea of a particular study that we think would be interesting and be told by participants in the community or potential participants that, well, that's a nice and interesting question, but it really isn't the question we need answered, and it isn't something that we care about or want to pay attention to. So when you're looking at a human dignity, it means paying attention to the ways in which the research questions you are asking are relevant to the people that you're working with. You need to treat them not just as subjects, but as active, engaged participants in the research. So in the community, the need for research is more often driven by awareness of local environment and engagement with the community. And so it may be easier to see the need to correctly identify research that addresses the dignity of participants. But it also may be more challenging to validate it. So again, we can often end up in a position where we're saying, I know this is an issue because I've heard it in my community, and it's not to say that perspective is not legitimate, but when you then turn to a funder and say, I need some research money to follow up on this question, it becomes much harder to validate or justify that particular research project. Now, the next principle is free and informed consent, and this involves ensuring that participants know what they are getting into, both in terms of what the study is seeking to understand and what the potential risks and benefits of their involvement might be. Now, in the university ethics review process, there is an expectation that consent forms, as this graphic suggests, will be thorough and comprehensive, which can result in seemingly onerous paperwork. But it's necessarily, particularly in relation to health research, where the language of medicine can interfere with participants' ability to make informed choices. So if you're asking someone if they're prepared to talk to you about, recombinant DNA, and can we take a sample of your blood so we can look for a particular illness, they may not understand the full implications of that. And so in a university ethics process, you're required to develop plain language documents that allow people to say, I know exactly what I'm being asked to do. I know entirely what the harms and benefits might be. And therefore, I can agree to participate or not on the basis of well-grounded information. Now, typically, bridging this communication gap is less of a problem in community-based research, where researchers and participants are more immediately engaged with one another. And often you will find that community research doesn't use consent forms because there is a pre-existing relationship that you're building on, a relationship of trust or engagement. But I believe that consent forms would be highly useful in community-based research because they clearly outline when, how, and for how long research can be used. And they give organizations conducting their research clear evidence that they are using evidence in an ethical manner. It's it can be less easy to demonstrate that participants have a clear knowledge when you're using consent forms, but it can help you with funders and then also with the people that you hope will use the results of the research, the people who will act upon it. They can say, oh, I know that this information was collected ethically, developed ethically, and therefore I can have confidence in the findings. Also, free and informed consent involves ensuring that participants understand that they can withdraw at any time, that they can determine how their words are used. So you would ask people, can I quote you or not? And in some cases, that the participants are given the right to vet the research and approve the analysis. And I'm going to speak to this in a little bit more detail shortly. The next principle is protecting privacy and confidentiality. Now, protecting the privacy and confidentiality of research participants can be really challenging, both for university and community-based researchers. University-based researchers are required to adhere to strict protocols such as encrypting data files on your computer so that no one can open them, and keeping hard copies of research under lock and key to protect the privacy and confidentiality of participants. While community-based researchers are much more likely to protect privacy and confidentiality by conducting the analysis and then destroying the research, whereas in universities you're actually required to keep that information for a period of 5 to 7 years, and on the grounds that there needs to be the ability to review the research if there's ever a question of the ethical rigor of a research project that comes up afterwards. And then you're required to destroy it after that. And each year you have to get approval saying, I'm still working on this analysis, I'm still working with this data. But in either case, researchers would remove identifying information about participants, not just their names, but also where they live, if they make reference to any landmarks in their communities or to particular businesses or healthcare settings or particular practitioners, in this case of health research. And all that information would be taken out before writing or talking about a research project. So even when you do all of that, though, you do your absolute best to protect the privacy and confidentiality of research participants, there's still limits to what you can do, particularly if you're involving people in focus groups. Because they're sitting together in a room, you obviously can't say, if person A knows person B, there's no way that you can guarantee that those people will never talk about each other outside of focus group settings. But you can let your research participants know that that's the risk that they face in participating in the project. Then if they choose to participate, they can go ahead and do so. There are also other instances, and we've come up against a few of these in our own research here, where you may be speaking with someone who may not be named, but when you're talking about particular research, readers might logically infer who the participants were. So, for example, if you are working on a project, right now I'm working on a project on the evolution of breast cancer networks in Atlantic Canada. I'm going to be talking to people in the breast cancer partnerships and in other organizations across the Atlantic region. So when I start talking about the New Brunswick Breast Cancer Partnership, there's a possibility that people will think, oh, you spoke with so-and-so, or you talked to that other person. So the imperative of protecting privacy is that we can diminish the possibility of unwanted side effects, so lack of access and control and feedback. And again, the issue of privacy and confidentiality may be more difficult within community-based settings because, particularly if you're working in smaller communities, lots of people tend to know each other, and this can be a real challenge. The next principle of a research ethics process is justice and inclusiveness. And this, I think, really amounts to asking at the front end of a research project who's involved and who's left out. And we often want to focus on people who have historically been marginalized in the research process. some of you may be aware of a lot of the research that's come out on clinical trials in the past number of years, which demonstrated that women for decades were systematically excluded from research on the grounds that their bodies would, their physiology would complicate a particular health research process. And as a result, we had really limited information about how certain drugs affected women and men differently or the same. We had, for a long time, we thought that it was only men in their 50s and 60s who were vulnerable to heart disease and heart attacks. And the research ethics review process has tried to shift those exclusions and shift those ethical gaps by saying, why are you focusing on particular populations? Why are you excluding other populations? And you need to have a really good reason for saying, it's not just that I find it uncomfortable to work with a particular group or I never thought about a particular group. The process of ethics review is meant to prompt people to say, okay, who should I be talking about? And particularly we are thinking women, people of color, people of all age, and often we tend to focus when we think of inclusiveness on people who are visibly different, so old people, young people, etc., male, female, people of color. But we also need to pay attention in this process to invisible categories of exclusion, such as sexual orientation, gender identity, spiritual and religious persuasion, where people are living. And again, you know, both community and the university need to be paying attention to these principles. And I believe that they probably face similar challenges. It's easier to work with people you know, people who are like you, than people who are not like you. But hopefully within a community-based setting, people are aware of who is in their community. And so there's, I think, a more automatic review of who's involved and who's not in these processes than there might be in a university without a formal review process. So the ethics review process requires people to think about this, and in the past they haven't because they're not as closely connected with the community as community-based researchers. Now, the vulnerable populations, paying attention to the needs of vulnerable populations is an important component of research ethics. And vulnerability is a word that we use often without necessarily being entirely clear about what it means or how we identify types of vulnerability. And usually we mean groups of people or individuals who are at a social or economic disadvantage for reasons related to race, ethnicity, sex and gender, lone parenting, etc. And this would be the understanding of vulnerability that most often informs community-based research. And it perhaps is closely aligned with the previous slide and the previous principle where we're looking for social justice. In the quest for social justice, we're paying attention to the people who are denied social justice. In the university, vulnerability is also understood this way, and it can be very challenging to get ethics approval to work with groups that are deemed to be vulnerable. Our examples of working with black women and lone mothers show us that we may have to go back and forth with an ethics review board 3, 4, 5 times before we get the language and the focus of the research fine-tuned to the point where the ethics review board feels that vulnerable populations are protected. And clearly this focus is based on a recognition of differences in power and the history of research abuses. So we don't want any more examples like Tuskegee, where vulnerable populations such as poor African Americans in the post-war period are victimized in the effort to, in the pursuit of knowledge, if you want to give it its happiest interpretation, or simply in the pursuit of careers, for example. And this particular graphic you see was developed by the Assembly of First Nations, who's worked on developing a set of ethics guidelines that particularly apply to First Nations peoples. And this is referred to as OCAP, which stands for ownership. Excuse me, I'm going to forget the C off the top of my head. Ownership, control, access, and possession. And this picture demonstrates the extent to which non-Aboriginal researchers have tended to take the the experiences and information from Indigenous peoples in Canada and utilize it for their own purposes, sometimes without ever returning that information to the people who originally shared it to them and not allowing them to have any control over the ways in which information is used to advance their health, their well-being. And OCAP, so ownership, control, possession, and access, ownership, control, access, and possession simply says if you're undertaking research with Aboriginal peoples, that they have a right to shared ownership of that information about themselves, that they have a right to control access to that information and control how it's used, and that they should be the holders of the information. So right now, a lot of information about our health and well-being in Canada is held by the federal government, by Statistics Canada and the Canadian Institutes of Health Information. And in the case of vulnerable populations of Indigenous peoples, they're saying we actually need to hold on to that data so we have more control over who uses it and to what ends. Now the last... sorry, I skipped a slide. I wasn't patient enough, I think. No, that's the right one. Balancing harms and benefits was the last principle of ethics review, the tri-council policies that I mentioned. Now, we're trying to, in the process of balancing harms and benefits, recognizing that you can't always eliminate harms and you can't always ensure only benefits, that what you're trying to do is balance the harms and benefits so that you get the fewest problems for those participants involved in the research and the greatest benefits. But the harms and benefits are always relative to a particular research project. So, for example, you could look at the differences between cancer research treatments versus research on food insecurity. In the case of cancer treatment research, you might argue that, or participants may say, I'm willing to take the risks involved in trying out this new drug because I believe that there's a possibility that it may save my life or save someone else's life. So the stakes are very high in that kind of research. And so there tends to be a sense that people are allowed to focus, are in a position to take more of a risk because they hope to have a bigger payoff. Whereas when you're doing research on something like food security, food insecurity or food security, you're not necessarily talking in the very immediate sense about a life and death situation. And so we there would be looking at minimizing the harms as much as we possibly can because the benefits are likely to be less dramatic in the short term at least and for the individual. So there's more attention being paid to the ways in which the research is conducted. And also we're trying to pay attention to a wide variety of harms and benefits. Here the case is, what the drugs, in this particular graphic, what the drugs are liable to do to an individual. And here we're really talking about physical and maybe to a lesser extent mental health. But when we're defining harms and benefits in research ethics processes, we need to pay attention to emotional and psychological and social harms and benefits as they affect the group. And I can give you an example of some research that we were trying to do recently around tattooing for breast cancer treatment and wanting to ask women what their experiences of tattooing were and how they felt about it. And when we started working with the Cancer Center here in Nova Scotia, they asked us immediately, well, we don't have any alternatives to tattooing for radiation treatment. So if you begin asking questions of patients, you may cause them upset that they would not have had ordinarily. And so there were lots of questions raised about whether this would be ethical to suggest that this wasn't a great process when there weren't any alternatives. And similarly, there might be concern about how any commentary about alternatives to tattooing might reflect poorly on healthcare providers. We know that in other places they don't use permanent tattoos, and there was concern about whether or not this would diminish patient confidence in the system and raise concerns about the reputation of particular healthcare providers and healthcare facilities. Now, there's, I think, tremendous emphasis in university-based research on reducing harms. And there's a much greater emphasis in community-based researchers on maximizing benefits. And I would say that the Tri-Council guidelines that I've been going through here are a real example of limiting harms. And the OCAP process that I just described a few minutes ago for Aboriginal peoples is much more about maximizing benefits. So we're focusing on the community taking control of research and information and data and making sure that it's used to their benefit. So I wanted to take a moment here and stop and just ask if there are any questions. No one has popped up with a question yet, but if you have something you'd like to ask at this point or that you've been dying to ask, I'm happy to answer any of those questions, or at least entertain them. Maybe I don't have an answer for the questions. That's all. So, Jen, should we...
Yeah, we'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to type in on the bottom of your screen. You'll see an area where you can write in either comments or questions for Dr. Barbara Clow. And as she said, she'll answer them the best that she can. So we'll just wait one moment and let people type anything in.
Sure. While people are thinking or typing, I'll just put up another slide here on the screen that can direct you to some particular examples of checklists and models for ethics review. The first one is the one I had been describing briefly, the OCAP. The second one is Center for Community-Based Research, which again, I think you'll find if you go to that website that the process, the principles are affirmed there, but the process is pretty informal or pretty loose by comparison with the third example, which is the Tri-Council policy. And you'll see it's very long and very, very detailed about what's involved in ethics processes.
Okay, well, I don't see any questions coming in so far. That means you've covered everything and answered everyone's questions. Thank you for presenting this and for providing us with those links. I know I'll definitely take a look at them. And this is the second time I've heard you present this, but I always learn something new, I find. So it's very much appreciated.
Great.
We're going to send out an evaluation for those of you who were on this call and those of you who actually view this after the live call. Please send me an email or I will check back and see who else has attended. My email is jmcneil, that's MCNEIL, @cbcn.ca. But I'm going to be sending out just an evaluation for those of you who attended this. And you can actually go in online and follow the link and the password that I'm going to send to you. It takes maybe 3 minutes, but it's definitely great information for both Barbara to have and for CBCN to have as well. So we'd greatly appreciate it if you would complete that. And I still don't see any other questions coming in. Barbara, is there anything else that you would like to say?
No, I just say thank you for people's attention. If you have questions, I'm happy to also try and answer your questions or at least maybe direct you to other resources. And my email is barbara.clow, CLOW, @dow.ca. I did have a bunch of questions coming from the Cancer Network after my other presentation. I'm very happy to help with that if I can.
Perfect. And actually, we just got a request to put the links back online. So I'll just put those back up so everyone can see just for a few more moments to write those down.
Yep. No problem.
Sure, there's lots of reading, but I'll forgive them.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of information.
Well, the interesting thing, too, about the OCAP model is that it's still in the process of development, so there's some really interesting discussion about why these particular principles have been identified and historically and currently, but there's still a lot of discussion about how to operationalize those principles, and definitely a lot of discussion about how do you link data collection through Aboriginal communities with data collection through universities, and how we make these two processes meet and meet the needs of everyone involved. So it'll be something to watch on an ongoing basis too.
Very interesting. Maybe actually what I'll do as well is I'll send out these links in the email with the evaluation, just so in case someone wrote down one wrong letter and can't get on, we'll provide them for you that way as well. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Barbara Clow, for joining us and for presenting this.
Thanks, Jen.
And thank you to our audience for participating in this as well. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Bye.